So this is a quick Q&A follow-up on the November 19th webinar that was conducted for the broadcast coordinate update. In reviewing the questions and answers from the webinar, we noticed a few that did not get answered adequately in the Q&A script, so wanted to make sure that we had answers for those as we move into session 2 and other events. So we'll go with that. We'll get started. Question was, when will the service be back online on January 6th? And does this update mean SmartNet will be down? Yes, we will be taking SmartNet offline on January 5th at 10 p.m. Eastern Time to publish the new coordinate and to bring them online. Typically, this takes between 4 and 8 hours, depending on any issues that we run into. So we would anticipate SmartNet to be back up and operational on January 6th, the morning of January 6th, between 2 a.m. But we would typically promise that everything would be back up by 5 a.m. Eastern Time. Second set of questions were GNSS questions. Will there be support for Galileo in the future in the Canadian market? Yes. So we are currently actively working in the Greater Toronto area to bring Galileo and full GNSS corrections into that market. We've run into some weather here just recently and some availability to get onto a few sites to do upgrades. But that is actively being worked on. Hopefully that will be finalized for the most part in the coming weeks. We do know that there are a couple of stations we will not gain access to until the spring. So we'll continue to work on that. In intervening areas west of Toronto, those will continue to be worked on, as well as east of Toronto into Ottawa. Those will continue to be worked on as well. The metropolitan Montreal market has already received GNSS upgrades, as has the BC market, the Calgary market, and I believe a majority of the Edmonton market as well. But we'll continue to work on that. You mentioned a planned 100% GNSS availability. What is the time frame to update reference station hardware that is GPS and GLONASS only? That is an active program that's always ongoing. So currently, as we referred to in the original webinar, 81% of SmartNet is currently GNSS. We are planning to get to 100%. That is a fairly long process. With 81%, 1,500 stations, that means that we still have a couple of hundred stations to go to reach that 100% mark. But we are actively working on it, specifically in metropolitan areas to begin with, and then working out from there. A couple other questions that came up for MRF questions, specifically in high dynamic areas. With California recently being updated as of November, last will only be from November to January, so users cannot go back to prior November adjustments. That is correct. We will be publishing the November, the January adjustment 2020, and that will mean that the last mount points will then be updated to 2019.750. That is typical of our normal cadence. It's not ideal for this particular purpose, but it is what we would need to stick with. Again, velocities play a part of this, and a lot of other things play a part of this, holding over those older coordinates for a longer period of time. For high dynamic areas, how long will old reference frames be available moving forward, and how far back do MRFs go? MRFs are always only go back to the last coordinate set, so they would only go back to the recently passed epoch. So currently today, on November 20th, we are our last reference frame in California, for example, is 2019.250, and that is the mount point, the MRF mount point that is available currently today. The 2018.750 mount point was deprecated when we released the fall adjustment, just as the 2019.250 mount point will be deprecated on January 6th when we then have a 2019.750 mount point available. Again, this is to make sure we adhere to our policies and standards, as well as being able to provide consistency as we move forward, dealing with velocities, etc. So a Canadian question was, how are we notified in BC when, if there are changes during the annual checks? And this doesn't apply to just BC. This applies to all stations or all areas of the network. If there are going to be changes to a station, those are done in due course. If there are changes, we will typically post a knowledge base article that states very clearly what stations were found in the annual checks to fall outside of our tolerances. So the tolerances are pretty simple, as we mentioned on the 19th webinar. 25 millimeter causes an alarm and an evaluation. 35 millimeters would cause us to take action. So from basically 30 millimeters to 100 millimeters, and we know that there's no physical mass change to that particular site. The site code would be left the same, so that we would have tracking, but we would update the RTCM ID, which is what goes out to the rover, and would typically be what would cause the most confusion in the marketplace. We would issue a site advisory in the site database, and we would also do some other checks on things on our side to make sure everything's looks correct, and then issue a new superseded coordinate into the site database along with the date of update. Greater than 100 millimeters, so greater than 10 centimeters, we would, and we know that there's no physical mass change on the site. Both the old site code, the old RTCM ID would be removed from service, and a new site code and RTCM ID would be issued. So that would functionally be a new site. Again, a site advisory would be created for the old site and the new site, and then we would create new coordinates for that station. Anytime a physical mass change is detected with SmartNet, a new site code, new site, and new RTCM ID is developed and created because that is functionally a new site. These, of course, do not apply in high dynamic areas. So in California, for example, as we update the broadcast coordinates, they have to go. It's a normal coordinate update. They'll carry the same site code and RTCM ID as we move those coordinates forward. But again, if there's a large jump that is outside the normal tolerances for the horizontal movement we expect in California, or the subsidence movement we see in the Central Valley, then we would take the steps to update site codes and RTCM IDs as necessary. We had a good question, and it actually kind of brings everything together really clearly. I kind of hate we missed it in the larger webinar. So the question was, so a fixed solution on a point on January 6th will be different from a fixed solution on January 5th? If so, by how much? So again, like we said in the original webinar, the solution may or may not be different depending on what station you're receiving a correction from. Some stations will have coordinate changes in the millimeter range. Others may have coordinate changes in excess of 5 centimeters. So those stations, you would see a different fixed solutions on January 6th than you did on January 5th. But it breaks it down really clearly, and I'm glad we got to see this question. I wish we'd got to it yesterday. But yes, there is a possibility that you would have a different fixed solution. Again, a vast majority of stations are going to have the millimeter level state, a millimeter level change. So inside the noise level of typically RTK, so you would most likely not see that. But for stations that have those larger variations, yes, you would see a different fixed solution on the 6th once the new realization or solution is launched. I think this got answered via comment by support, but wanted to go ahead and address it as well. How do we get the new GeoEd 18 update firmware in the data collector? That is going to be hardware and possibly even vendor specific. GeoEd 18 is available on the NGS website, but how you would load it on your particular flavor of equipment, you would have to talk to your vendor of choice. As far as when you can start using this, you would not want to start using this until the MYCS2 solution is published on January 6th. And at that time, you would have that option. Another good question. I think we roundabout answered this question in the webinar, but wanted to directly take it on, specifically how it was asked. How will this update affect current local coordinate systems, local transformations, calibrations, et cetera, that were built using the current realization or solution being broadcast? You would need to update that. So if you've got a local coordinate system, 5,000, 5,500, 10,000, 10,000, 1,000, or whatever local coordinate system that you may have created, even if it's a 1.1 step localization that you've done to tie to state plane or some other regional coordinate system, you would need to plan to update that localization after January 6th by performing a new localization or transformation. You can, again, rely on the MRF coordinates, or excuse me, the MRF reference frames, the NYCS1 or solution V6 for a period of time. But when those mount points are deprecated in the spring, you would need to be prepared to utilize the new realization of the solution on the standard mount points. This kind of ties to it as well. Changing the current reference frame for existing long-term projects could have a significant impact financially and contractually. We perform monitoring projects that require 5 to 10 years of annual monitoring. Going forward, I see starting new projects in the new reference range, but the existing reference frame needs to stay longer for a longer period of time. And we understand this. We understand this all too well. However, this goes back to velocities and our ability to maintain those coordinates over a long period of time as we bring new stations on, or even if we have to move a station in that localized area, it could have significant effects on that. If you have that much tied up in it, you will need to make a transformation, a localization, a calibration, so that you control the control on the site and not just completely rely on the coordinates on a station. This would be no different than if we had to, if we lost a station and we had to re-erect it. There's going to be challenges or problems that could occur depending on the type of monitoring project. So if this was your question, it was actually an anonymous person, so we can't reach out to you directly. But you do happen to hear this, please reach out. We'll be happy to talk to you about this. Similarly, what if a project just kicked off and localized using a current broadcast coordinates and will continue months, if not a year, following the update? What would you do to make sure everything checks in and is accurate? Again, the first thing you'd want to do is see if the stations that you are using typically for that localization are affected by the change. So if they only have a few mil change, then you've got to do nothing. If it's a large change, one of the stations has a large change, then you would need to change the mount point that you're using temporarily, and then make accommodations as you have time to do localization, a transformation, or calibration to begin using the MYCS2 or version 7.1 solution for the US and Canada. Would any design DTM coordinates changes be needed to swing or rotate? Same thing. If you have a DTM that's tied to a particular project, if the stations that service that project are not changing, are not having their coordinates updated appreciably, then no, you do not have to make any accommodations. If they are being updated appreciably, then yes, you would need to make accommodations as you approach the spring adjustment when the MYCS1 and version 6 mount points would be deprecated. So you want to make sure you take that into account. So that's, I think, all the questions that we missed during the original webinar. So we just wanted to take a quick minute to do a quick updated recording and an appending to this so that you would have that. If you do have any additional questions, feel free to send them into support if they weren't asked in this webinar or answered in this webinar. Or again, you can attend one of the other two webinars on December 10th or December 19th and ask those questions with everybody else around, and hopefully help somebody else out that might have that same question. Again, thank you very much for your continued use of SmartNet, and just wanted to get this out there. Thanks.